So we're continuing through chapter 23. Today specifically in verses 12 to 22. Next week, in the next lesson, we'll then finish off the chapter. And then things starts kind of skipping forward from there. So here in today, the verses 12 to 22. So let me read the passage and then we'll go from there. So, Acts chapter 23, verses 12 to 22. Now when it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 who formed this scheme. They came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a curse to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. So now you, along with the Sanhedrin, notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more carefully. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, he came and entered the barracks and reported it to Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him. So he took him and led him to the commander and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." And the commander took him by the hand and, stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the Sanhedrin, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more carefully about him. So do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of them, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him, are lying in wait for him, and now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you." So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. This is a relatively shorter passage, not terribly complex, so there won't be deep rabbit holes to run down. But nevertheless, let's begin in verse 12.
I've got one.
I'm sure we'll probably find some. Verse 12. So now when it was day, so referring to the next day, following on from the kangaroo court that we saw in the last lesson. Now when it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. Fortunately, the evil of these words should be fairly self-evident. But they conspire together, binding themselves under a curse. In other words, they take an oath that they will not eat or drink until they have actually killed Paul. They're dedicating themselves to that work, basically under the threat of their own death through starvation or through dehydration. The text assumes that this vow is made to God. You could try and argue it was made to something else, but that would be a stretch beyond what the text is probably containing within it. So they are swearing an oath to God that they will kill this heretic for him, and they will not rest until they have done to do so, essentially. Needless to say, such an oath would not be well received. But point being, we'll continue on that as we go through the next couple of verses. Luke identifies that there was more than 40 of them who formed this scheme, so it's not like it's just a couple of random extremist figures. It's not just a couple of overly passionate young men. It's a group of 40 who probably know each other. This group is potentially, not just potentially, probably most likely made up of the Zealots or the Sicarii, or both, who are groups that we've covered in church history classes, very violent and sadistic groups there in the first century among the Jews, who were primarily focused on violently overthrowing the Romans and ushering in the kingdom of God as far as they wanted it. It's potential that those figures are among that. It's not mentioned here, so it may not be. But I'm saying it's potentially possible. And so what does this group do? They come to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We've bound ourselves under a curse to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. So now you, along with the Sanhedrin, notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more carefully, and we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near." Now, this ties into obviously a lot of points that were made in the previous weeks, and especially last week. Nothing in what the Jews have done thus far, as evil and corrupted as it is, has somehow squandered their opportunity per se to actually have killed Paul. We saw that they nearly did it in the temple complex. They could very easily have done it in the last lesson, so in other words, the day prior to this event. But they all descended into a riot over a theological disagreement between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so this is just pouring further and further condemnation upon them. Every single instance that they've interacted with Paul at this juncture here in Jerusalem has been grotesquely unlawful and immoral, and so then their solution is to do something even more unlawful and immoral, and just to try to seek to extrajudicially kill him once again. Probably one could posit that this group saw this as a solution to the failure that occurred the day prior, right? To the debacle that was, and so then instead of to trying to avoid any further dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and coordinating this assassination plot essentially is obviously the direction they decided to go in. Again, a lot of the points that could be made here have been made in previous weeks about hypocrisy and about malice and about evil, the blinding hypocrisy of those who are attempting to judge and adjudicate Paul according to the law, then spend the entire ordeal violating the law in every possible way that they can.
Well, they're also violating the Roman law too, because I assume that he would be accompanied by an escort.
Exactly. So what killing Paul means is either killing Paul and trying to escape, or just killing the entire group.
Which would also mean instant death for all of them.
Correct.
Because I could imagine the rest of the garrison would not be too far away. I don't know how far this council was.
That's what I explained in previous weeks, is the Antoninian fortress and the temple complex are right next to each other.
So how can you ambush?
in the hallway, in the tunnel of the hallway that connects the two complexes.
Oh, right.
So it's a good place for an ambush.
Is it? Okay.
Well, it would be, yeah. It's narrow. It has one entrance, one exit.
They might as well be the Judean Suicide Squad.
I suppose.
But this so stupid they can't see God's protecting him.
Correct.
It's that, but I'm just looking at the actual mechanics of what
the logistics of it. Well, they have a good spot for an ambush.
Yeah.
Ambushing them on the route between the Antoninian fortress and the temple complex would be a good place to do it, because it's confined. It's underground.
The Romans wouldn't take it very well, though.
No, not at all. No, but then that's why I suggested that maybe, and I'm not trying to go beyond the text because it doesn't say they were zealots, but it may not be what Luke's focusing on. They may have been zealots. Who knows? They wouldn't have had a problem. In fact, that would have been part of the.
Well, Jesus had some apostles that were zealots as well. So
yeah, exactly. Simon the Zealot. Yeah,
was a very real
correct.
thing.
Yeah, Simon the Zealot. Exactly. He converts out of the zealots to Christ. Yeah. It's possible, yeah. So anyway, they're plotting and scheming, and and the Sanhedrin obviously agree to go along with this plot.
And I think you said last week you wondered if they actually died of hunger.
Yeah. Well, we'll get onto that by the time we get to the end of the day.
Oh, okay. All right.
But when the son of yeah, exactly. So verse 16. But when the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, he came and entered the barracks and reported to Paul. So there's a couple of things in that verse. Evidently, Paul's family are present here in Jerusalem, which does make sense because he's here for Pentecost, so it makes sense that his family are here. We're not told anything more about his family. We're not told anything about his sister's son.
Well, except that he must have been extremely young by the way the Tribune took him aside.
Yes, exactly. That's the only detail we can infer, is that it's unlikely that the Roman Tribune grabbed a 35-year-old man by the hand and took.
Maybe 10 years old or less. Perhaps.
Yeah, could be a young man in his teens. Something. Yeah, it's Paul's nephew. So.
But that leads me to be able to say, well, they just thought he was a child. What would he be able to do if he overheard?
Boy or young man? Yeah, correct, exactly. So there needed to be a level of auspiciousness to it. So there needed to, how he heard this. Again, we're not told. But he's obviously somewhere in and around the temple complex. He may have already been going to visit Paul, which might be why he's near the temple. Again, all these things are just inferences. They're logical inferences, and there are...
But the fact, if they were having a plot, how did this person know about it unless he just happened to be a child playing nearby and overheard?
That's what I'm trying to... Yeah, exactly correct, yes.
It might be deviating a little bit, but it kind of goes back into... So at Pentecost, people were baptised during that. Or did that happen?
No. So Pentecost normally is the...
I know the pouring of the Holy Spirit.
Oh, that's so. Yeah, so I'm referring. Yeah, sorry.
That's Christians.
Yeah, so I'm referring to. So we call it Pentecost. This is what it's called. Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks. Pentecost means the 50th day. 50 days after Passover or Easter was the normal Feast of Weeks, as it was called, right? Or Pentecost, right?
Penta as in 5.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, like a pentagram.
Yeah.
Right? And so that all the way back in Acts chapters 1 and 2, right, is then God uses that day strategically because you have millions of Jews from all around the place to then, with the outpouring of the Spirit, blah, blah. And so then Pentecost becomes known for that, right? And so when I'm referring to Pentecost, like we're going to celebrate Pentecost, obviously, in whatever it is now, 7 weeks time or something, or 8 weeks time, whatever it is. They're in Jerusalem for Pentecost. They're not Christians celebrating Pentecost as Christians celebrate it, which is based on what happened on Pentecost. That's what I'm referring to. Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
The ancient Jews had so many more feasts than we did.
Yeah, well, it depends on how much one upholds the Christian calendar. But yeah, I'm with you.
The Jewish calendar. The Feast of Tents, the Jubilee year.
Oh, sure,
Pentecost. The Passover.
Yeah. But many of those things find their reflection, obviously, then in again everything during Holy Week from Palm Sunday through to obviously, Good Friday and then Easter Sunday, and then reflections of exactly what was going on at that time as well. Obviously, Christmas is then distinct for obvious reasons. Pentecost continues through Ascension is distinct in that sense as well. And there's a whole host of other things as well. But yeah. Anyway, one or another, Paul's nephew overhears this plot. But the prevailing point is it's not. It doesn't much matter how this logistically occurred. The fact that it did happen is what's in focus, right?
Oh yeah. I'm just curious because most people don't sort of openly let plots leak out.
No, exactly. How he heard it. The focus of the text is that he did hear it.
Yes.
And that he did hear it. And again, ultimately here is that when you piece this together with other portions of these chapters, is that all of this is the providence of God. Is that of all the people in all the world who heard this plot, it just so happened to be Paul's nephew. And just so happens in that case means not just so happens.
And he was courageous.
Very intentionally and obviously happened because of the sovereignty of God. Which there's a point there to be made as well, but I'll leave it to the end. So he comes into the barracks, and that shouldn't be. This is why knowing a bit of the history is important. So today you don't just enter into a prison. Today you have to come through during strict visiting hours, and it has to be scheduled pretty well in advance, and so on and so forth. That's for a variety of reasons. The nature of this prison is very different than the nature of our modern prisons, but that's another issue altogether. In the ancient world, throughout most of human history, but especially in this time, the prison or the jail, whichever word you'd like to use, didn't provide food and water and clothing, etc., right? All of the prisons or jails, historically speaking, for the vast majority of human history in most cultures are, and certainly in the ancient Near East, were were places where you would hold someone while they were waiting trial, right? Which we obviously still do today as well, in that respect. What we call into a jail as opposed to a prison, we make that kind of distinction. And so ancient prisons didn't provide, in this case of the Roman context, didn't provide food and water and stuff. That was the responsibility of the family to provide that, right? So that's why then when Jesus talks about, about those, feeding and clothing the prisoners, and that act of kind of Christian compassion or charity, that's the context in which it means, right? It doesn't make terrible sense. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to take that and then try and implant that literal concept of clothing and feeding the prisoners, because we don't do that today systematically, right? So that's why understanding the history is important, because then you understand what the different concepts or figures of speech mean.
It's similar to other countries with hospitals. The family is expected to come in and
Yes,
provide
correct.
food and
Exactly,
that sort
correct.
of
Turkish hospitals are still like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Which ones?
Turkish hospitals.
yeah. There's many across Asia that are like that. Yeah, and so
I think a lot of Asian ones too.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's the concept that's being played here. So him going into the barracks is nothing at all uncommon whatsoever. In fact, Paul's family would have been in and out of there every day.
Lunch, dinner, breakfast.
Yeah. Because that's the nature of how the jails worked. And so him going in there is not like he didn't need to sneak in there. No, he would have walked. Yeah, he would have gone in there very normally, and that's why he's out. So understanding that historical context is important for there as well. So in verse 17, at the end of verse 16, he reports the ambush to Paul. Verse 17, Paul then calls one of the centurions to him and says, "Lead this young man to the commander," which we explained before. Commander here is one of the tribunes, right? And it's the highest ranking officer involved in this whole ordeal. For he has something to report to him. So he, the centurion, took Paul's nephew and led him to the tribune and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you since he had something to tell you." Right, so again, young man, he's probably in his teens somewhere there. Younger.
Just to stop you there,
Mm-hmm.
what sort of prison condition would have Paul been in? Would he have had a private room and just kept in custody, or would he been in a dungeon in chains and?
No, he wouldn't have been in. He certainly wouldn't have been in kind of ball and chain as we think of it. No, not as a Roman citizen in this scenario, and not while this whole thing is all still very convoluted and up in the air.
Would he have had a guard outside to make sure he didn't run away?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah. Of course. Yes. That's why the centurion's just there.
Yeah. Okay. I wouldn't think a centurion would be guarding him. It'd just be a normal legion.
It's because we've got this scenario where.
High profile.
Yeah. Correct.
Okay. Yep. Good.
Yeah. That's why we've seen centurions and tribunes interacting. No tribune is just interacting with a Joe Schmo prisoner or whatnot. It's because this is a very high profile case and probably would have been the most high profile. That's why a couple of weeks ago, when they first rescued Paul from the riot at the temple, and they asked that, and he starts speaking Greek, and they say they deduce, well, you're not the Egyptian we've been looking for, that blah blah. And I mentioned that zealot revolt in Egypt and blah blah. And so so this is high profile. That's
because
why.
we're talking about prison conditions that he was under. So I got curious as to what.
Oh, it's not. He's not. He's not in some dungy.
Yeah.
French prison in the 1700s with rats everywhere. No, this is not. Yeah, no. This is as a Roman citizen and high profile. Yeah, he's not in like some.
Okay.
Yeah, hole beneath a hole. So verse 19. The commander took him by the hand, Paul's nephew, that is, and stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately. Right. What is this that you have to report of me?
Which is what you do to a smallish
That's
child.
yeah. Well, that's why it identifies in verse 18 of him being a young man. So we're talking teens here, roughly speaking. And the nephew said in verse 20, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the Sanhedrin, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more carefully about him. So do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of them who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him, are lying in wait for him, and now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you." Right. So in other words, he just tells him exactly what he heard. This, of course, would have gone swimmingly with the commander, and he would have been very happy to hear that these guys were going to try and not just kill their prisoner, but also probably or potentially kill them as well. So the commander let the young man go, instructing him, "Tell no one that you have notified me of these things." There's a multitude of points here. As I said, it's a shorter point today because next week's passage I want to spend. We could continue through, but there's more historical details to flesh out in the next passage.
If you're a bit more Machiavellian, what you would do is you would agree, but not send Paul, but have all your garrison out to just ambush the ambush.
Yeah, well, yeah, correct. Yeah, if you were, if you wanted to try and snuff this, you would then, use a body double of some kind, and then pretend that you're moving Paul, and then counter ambushed. Yeah, which they could have done, but alas, they don't. We'll say that next week's lesson. There's a number of points that should be drawn here, which kind of on the big points of this shorter passage today. The first of which is that, as you've seen here, and then next week, in continuation of what we've already seen in previous weeks, you have the pagans, the Romans, constantly obeying the law, not just their own law, but laws that also happen to actually be good laws in conformity with God, and going out of their way to protect the man of God, while the supposed chosen ones and the supposed people of God are going out of their way to try and murder him in violation of every single portion of the law they could ever point their finger at. And so that contrast, well, I'm saying to you, as I said, like through these chapters, you've got to kind of see the meta-narrative weaving its way through. The pagans are upholding the law of God better than the people of God are in this respect. Now the reality is they're not the people of God. They've rejected God in this case. They rejected Christ. Paul is the people of God. But those who have rejected have descended into doing what's right in their own eyes. Their actual care for the law is all surface level. It's feigned. Hence, of course, you are whitewashed tombs filled with dead men's bones, all that kind of rhetoric. But here, the pagan Romans are the ones who are constantly going out of their way to defend and protect God's man, Paul. They're the ones who are concerned with violating or not violating, in this case, the law, right? Their own law, in that case, the Roman law. But in this specific instance, it includes extrajudicial killings. Right, so extrajudicial is in beyond the law, right? Beyond what's lawful.
Assassinations.
Yeah, correct.
There's another country that currently does a lot of that.
Well, there's many countries that do assassinations.
Some you know about, some you don't.
Oh yeah, they're called Reaper drones.
Most you don't know about. But nevertheless, this is just what this is, and we're coming to the tail end. Obviously, next week's kind of the formal ending of this portion of what we've been going through, kind of chapters 20, 21, 22, 23, this whole section here of the Jerusalem affair, as I just generally call it. But yes, as you're going to then see, not to comment on it, but if you just read the next, two verses in 23 and 24, and when he had called to him 2 of the centurions, he said, "Make ready 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and others cavalry, 200 spearmen, so pilum, as they're called in the Roman military, to proceed to Caesarea by the 3rd hour of the night, so in other words, 9 p.m, and provide mounts, horses, to put Paul on and bring him safe."
That's a troop of almost 500 people.
It's his whole cohort. Yeah, correct.
Is it? Yeah.
Well, almost. Yeah.
Who's protecting Jerusalem?
That's his whole. Well, correct. He's basically left a skeleton. He's basically left a skeleton. Well, there's many cohorts in it. There's the whole. I can't remember which legion's in charge at this time. I want to say that. I want to say the 18th. I can't remember. The legions move around frequently. It might even be the 20th. I'd need to have a look.
But would they have only had one legion in Jerusalem at the time, or would they have?
Well, no. That legion, the legion in charge, the legion responsible for Judea.
Yeah.
There's an entire legion over the whole course of Judea, overall Judea. How many are in Jerusalem? Well, the bulk of them are going to be in Jerusalem and Caesarea Maritima.
Okay.
So there might be 2 cohorts here in Jerusalem.
So he's not totally left himself.
Oh no, he wouldn't. No, but that numbering of, that's why I wanted to point it out, of 200 legionnaires.
Yeah.
70 cavalry.
Yeah. And 200.
So 70 eques, or the knights, in other words.
Yeah.
And 200 pilum or spearmen. That's their cohort.
So from
broadly, it's more complex than that, but yeah.
What I saw, that the horsemen were used as a vanguard on either side of the actual
That's
group.
correct, yeah.
So they would...
As a general rule, yeah.
Yeah, they would pre-patrol the route,
Yeah.
looking for any ambushes or anything like that.
Well, they'd send an advance vanguard of cavalry. They'd
Yes.
then have the bulk of the cavalry flanking the light infantry.
It's very cleverly
And heavy
done.
infantry.
These guys weren't idiots militarily.
Oh no, they're the best military the world had seen to that point in history.
Well, even these days, we could learn a thing or two from how they did things.
Roman military doctrine is still integral to Western military philosophy. Yeah. This is Well, he's bringing basically the bulk of a cohort to transport him from Jerusalem to Caesarea Maritima, to the provincial capital.
So I don't have a map, but how far is that? Because
I'd want to say about 200 miles, maybe, but I'll have
okay,
to.
no, it's a fair trip then. Because part way, if you read on it, they turned back after at 70 miles before there, didn't they?
Well, we get onto that, yes.
Yeah, something like that. So some of them have turned back already. I'm not wanting to read ahead, but it must have been a fairly lengthy trip if only the horsemen.
No, a bit less. I blew it out a bit too much. More like about 110 kilometres. So yeah, no, not much less.
That's from here to Sydney.
Yeah, basically from here to Sydney. Yeah.
So Sydney CBD.
I overestimated. Yeah, basically. So obviously a lot of that bulk was just to get them out of Jerusalem and out of the surrounding region, where they're more likely to face attack. But anyway, point I'm drawing here is that and we'll talk about that passage next week, or in the next lesson.
Sorry.
But no, that's fine. So the broad points here. Those who profess themselves to be the chosen ones are doing everything they can to actually murder and assassinate the one who actually is the chosen one of God, or among the chosen ones of God, namely Paul. They pay lip service to the law and brutalize those around them for their lack of law keeping, while they themselves trample upon the law every single time they do something like this. Meanwhile, the pagans, ironically, are the ones who, again, doesn't mean they're good, it doesn't mean they're right with God, none of that, but it's the ironic contrast that's meant to be part of why Luke's recounting it this way, is that the pagan Romans are being more moral and law-abiding here than the Jews are.
So I don't want to justify their actions here, but I always try to look at people's the motives that might be in action here, and one of the biggest motives is that flocks of people are leaving them, becoming Christians, and so therefore their motive is that they're a loss of power,
and have been for about 25 years or so by now. Yeah.
And this person is one of the main reasons this is happening. And so, therefore, they
as far as they're concerned, the primary, certainly around the world.
So, the solution to this problem of them losing power and wanting to get the people back is to take him out.
Correct. Yeah, Paul is a more practical influence at this time than any of the other apostles. And not to diminish them. It's just simply about globally. I mean.
And in neurology, it's been shown that we have a part of our brain that has to rationalise even our motives. So if we do something out of motive, we then rationalise the reason for it, and their rationality is, he is, just desecrating the temple. He's misleading the people.
Yeah.
When really, all they really want to do is they want to keep their power.
He's a threat.
Yeah.
And that's where
rationalise stuff that's just totally random.
Correct, and that's part of one of the broader points. Yeah, exactly. The is that
it's our
we
nature.
correct, and we have a whole host of proverbial statements that express this kind of thing. One of course would be that the road to hell is paved with good intention, which is true, which is a truism, right? As a general principle, it's true.
No good deed goes unpunished. That's another one.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Now the reason why that kind of, if I just talk about that modern English idiom of the the road to hell is paved with good intention. That often gets mistook for intentions being irrelevant. They're not irrelevant. The problem is that they are not. Intentions are not definitive. Let me backtrack. Intentions are not categorically explanative of how effective or even moral, more importantly, the outcomes of those intentions actually are. So that is just simply to say that intentions are but part of the equation, and really in the grand scheme of things, a minor part, okay, as a general principle. Having good intentions, all that does is it clears you of what, say in legal terms, for example, we would call, mens rea, right? Corpus mea, what you'd have of the guilty mind, right? That doesn't obfuscate the guilty action that then kind of comes out as a result of that, right? That's why we make distinctions between, to use colloquial
manslaughter
terms,
and murder.
Murder and manslaughter, right?
Yeah.
They're both forms of homicide, or the killing of a man, but we make distinctions, and rightfully so, and we have for centuries now, upon that basis of the distinction between, well, for more than that, probably 1,000 plus years.
One's meditated, one's non-meditated.
Yeah, correct. So premeditation, right, with malice aforethought, as it's used in different jurisdictions. That notion of a guilty mind is part of the equation, and so without the guilty mind, in other words, without the malice aforethought, the planning, etc., into a crime, like a hit and run or something, for example, speaking an example here, there's a whole host of crimes that have that and don't have that. That doesn't then negate the crime itself, right? So you're still guilty and morally, or in this case legally culpable and guilty of the crime in question. You just may be not guilty of the most severe form of that crime, right? That's why all of those things which we have in the common law tradition in the Anglosphere are all of them flow forward in that regard from the scriptures, right? They're all entirely biblical concepts. You see this in a whole host of other examples. In the Old Testament, there is provision, for example, for when someone breaks into your home in the middle of the night and you, defending your home and your family, kill them, you're not guilty of any crime. Part of the reasoning or part of the rationale behind that is that it's dark, you have no idea who they are,
what weapons they got,
what weapons they have,
are
they by themselves, how many are there, all those kinds of factors, right? And you don't have time to sit down and figure all those things out, right? So killing them in that instance is perfectly lawful. If it's during the day, it's not that defending your property or your family goes out the window. It's just that there's a different set of categories that apply where it's not just carte blanche free for all, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So the actual notion of guilty act, so actus reus and mens reus, which are those two concepts I'm referring to, the guilty act and then mens reus, the guilty mind, are part of the principle what I'm trying to draw out here is that their intentions in them, as far as they perceive them, right, that's an important distinction, as far as they perceive them, are entirely righteous as far as they're concerned. We are defending the integrity of the covenant. We're defending the integrity of the people of God. There's this heretic named Saul or Paul who is an apostate. He's rejected. He's following this false Messiah. He's trying to lead the people astray. He's leading them into apostasy, and we have to put an end to it.
That's rationalisation.
No, I know. That's exactly the point I'm making. And even the prescription of what they were trying to do to him, namely kill him, was also within the broader jurisprudential context of the law an appropriate action, right? The punishment for apostasy in the Old Testament is death, and that's very, very clear.
After a trial.
Correct. And this is the point. That's what I'm saying. It's up to a point, right?
Well, they've gone with trial so far.
Right, and so that's why I made the important distinction of saying the end, like the action that they were seeking to take. The problem that then comes is that all of this was to be done within very detailed and strict legal parameters, none of which are being followed. Because really, that's my whole point, is that the intentions are, even in themselves, in one sense, feigned, right?
Jews
The
justify them.
correct. Exactly. The reality here is that they are not truly actually ultimately concerned with the integrity of the religion of God, with the integrity of the temple, with this and that and da. Well, they are their temple, that's another show together. They are concerned. They're concerned with the system that they have an iron fist raised upon. They're concerned with they're concerned with the system of religious and political power that they control, and they are concerned with the integrity of what Christ calls the synagogue of Satan. That's what they're concerned about. They're concerned with the integrity of their false religion, which has, as obviously the New Testament goes on to very clearly explain, rejected God wholesale. The idea or the version of what they decide to call God is not in fact the true God, but they are, as Christ says, this system, and what they're doing is of their father the devil, because it's rejected the Messiah, which is part of the stupendous foolishness of what I pointed out in previous lessons about how every single one of them knew that this time in history was when the Messiah was meant to come. And yet every single one of them watched that time period just sail right by them with no one being claimed as the Messiah. That's the full, do you know what I'm saying? And so then all of that then has to get reinterpreted through the 1st and 2nd century. And so then now the Jews are still waiting for the Messiah, even though every one of them 2,000 years ago knew the Messiah was coming at that time. But then none of them actually, they never actually latched onto anyone as the Messiah in a genuine sense. They then started to reinterpret it, even by the time you get to the Jewish-Roman War, a decade later from this point, they really kind of just, some of them interpreted it as some of their leaders, the leaders of the Zealots and the Sicarii. Some of them use it in this vague messianic concept of the people as the Messiah, right, as a group. Like, it's just, but that's what happens when you abandon the scriptures. You abandon truth. Yeah, exactly. And so here, this is kind of the ending. Well, this and then the next passage, which follows directly on from it, but we'll cover it in the next lesson, is the ending of this Jerusalem affair.
Just one side question.
Mm-hmm.
Why did the Tribune feel it necessary to tell the child to tell nobody? And I guess that meant his mother and anybody else.
He doesn't want.
I thought the child would know to keep his mouth shut after going to the Romans.
Well, it's probably just to reinforce that he doesn't want. Obviously, they need to. The only way to foil a covert plot like what the Jews are plotting here is to keep the whole thing under wraps, so that you can then counter it without having, because if that gets exposed, then any potential actions that you might take get exposed, right? So the less people know about this, the better, and that's just a general tactical principle. I
suppose the temptation for a 10-year-old is to go to his mates and you say, you'll never guess who I just talked to.
Yeah, correct. That's my point. Yeah, exactly. It's him not trusting what's probably a teenager to what we would call a teenager. So he's just reinforcing that. Don't tell your family. Don't tell this, and also you don't want. It sounds counterintuitive, but when you understand a bit about how those kinds of things work, it makes much more sense. When in a military context or in any other context at all, security context, when you discover that there is a covert plot of some kind against a particular target, like human or even just an actual hard target like a structure, you don't want that knowledge getting out, because it only makes your ability to counter it even more difficult. There are sometimes where that's not the case. Sometimes blaring the horn will cause them to call it off.
Yeah, they won't do it. Yeah, because they found out. Yes.
But you don't want your enemy to know that you know.
Yeah, correct. You don't want your enemy to. It's exactly right. And so because you actually want to be able to, you don't just want to be able to stop the plot. You actually want to be able to catch the plotters, right? It's like how, for example, it's not strictly the same, but it's along the same lines. Like during World War II, the German code machine, which was named the Enigma, was a very complex computer system for its time, and it was used by German military headquarters to pump out all of their coded messengers and orders all around the theatres of war. because it was German. It was very sophisticated technologically, as they were. The British ended up forming a unit of very intelligent people, led by a man named Alan Turing, who was basically the inventor of what would go on to become the computer.
Modern universal computing machine.
Yeah, correct, exactly. And to create a machine to then be able to crack the Enigma code. They do that, they cracked that in 41.
The Polish actually got the earlier version of Enigma first.
Correct, they didn't, but then...
They never cracked Hitler's Enigma.
Exactly.
Hitler had another level up.
He did, yeah, correct, yeah. Because there were multiple levels, exactly.
Yeah.
And they needed to get the whole gamut, otherwise they could then... Because then the problem is that then even when, not long after the Polish managed to crack it, the Germans then changed the whole thing again.
Yeah, they expanded.
Yeah.
But it was the ones the submarines were using they really wanted to
Yeah, the U-boats, yeah, particularly.
Yeah.
And so that's what the British were very primarily concerned with.
That's why suddenly all the U-boats started dying. Ooh, what's happening here?
Yeah, well, yes and no. So one of the problems that then arose is that if the British then revealed, so the British cracked the Enigma.
That's the Coventry incident.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, correct. That's Coventry incident.
Coventry incident.
Yeah.
They had to let a ship deliberately sink so that the Germans.
And that wasn't the only one. That was just the first major one because I think it was one of the admirals of the fleet had his son on the ship and had to let him die.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a very high-ranking man
that
in the admiralty. Because the problem is if then the British just started all of a sudden sinking U-boats left, right, and centre, the Germans figure out.
They changed the Enigma.
Oh, they've figured out our codes and.
Boom.
The next day, all those codes are going to be changed.
Well, the machines will be changed.
That's my point.
Yeah.
And the years of work just goes down the toilet in about 5 minutes, right? So the British then had to spend the next 4 years of the war. And this is my point about the burden of leadership. All the way up to Churchill and the entire war cabinet had to spend, the whole war cabinet, British, Churchill included, had to make very difficult decisions of what German plans do we foil and which ones don't we foil.
Yeah.
Right? Because the worst thing that can happen is that we just start intercepting and destroying and sabotaging missions. The Germans are going to know that we figured out their code, that we're reading their messages. Right?
So who would we sacrifice?
And they had to make all those decisions before you. That's the burden of leadership that no one understands.
I'm currently reading.
Well,
I don't want it.
yeah, exactly.
So I'm currently
Yeah,
reading a book about how they had this group at Bletchley Park that was trying to work out exactly that, who they let die, who they don't.
Oh, there was an entire portion. Yeah, correct, exactly.
But the Germans also had another group that were also trying to work out how much of our secrets does the Allies know. And so they were trying to. There was
a cat and mouse game the whole war, yeah.
The whole war.
And so that's why you don't want to. Yeah. So to answer that question of what is just one sentence for us, tell no one you've notified me of this thing. The Romans wouldn't want anyone outside, any one of the citizens to know, especially Paul's family, because then what do you think Paul's family are going to be tempted to try and do?
Oh, yeah.
They're going to try and rescue him from the jail, and they're going to do this. And then as soon as the Jews start seeing that, they're going to go, wait, why is Paul's family? Oh, they know we're coming. Oh, the Romans know we're coming, and that could actually cause more of a problem.
Well, then instead of our ambush being in the tunnel, obviously the Romans are going.
We're going to change it. We're going to ambush him somewhere else, and so they can counter the plan, and so that's why you don't want to. That's why you never want to reveal. I'll finish on this point. There's three forms of military operations. There's overt, which is just what you hear all the time, just the invasion of Iraq or the invasion of Afghanistan. Covert operations, which are done, as the name suggests, covertly, so they're not obvious, and you'll hear about it maybe, but you generally won't hear who did it outside of rare circumstances. So
decades later.
Yeah. So the Americans taking out Bin Laden back in 2011 in Pakistan was a covert mission. There's no way the world's not going to hear about Bin Laden being taken out, and they only chose to reveal that it was the Americans more for national closure, which makes sense. But then there's a whole host of things which everyone in this room, myself included, will never hear about, and that's clandestine operations. You'll never know they happened. You never know who did it, and blah blah blah. That's how the world works.
Just an interesting side story. They actually got a dead drunk Irishman, dressed him up in a RAF uniform as a RAF captain, with a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, which had all the evasion plans for Calais that they let wash ashore.
Yeah.
they were never going to invade Calais.
No,
But
no.
Hitler took that totally in, and all his forces were down at Calais when they made the D-Day landing.
Yeah, well, they did that. So
Up
they
at
did that in
Normandy.
both directions. They pushed them down. They tried to make them go down to Calais, and they did to a degree. They then also spent about a year and a half feigning that they were going to stage an invasion of Norway from Scotland across the North Sea. A whole bunch of...
Is that why the Bismarck and that were up there?
Yep.
Right.
And
Stop
so,
it.
because they'd spent about a year and a half, it took them a year and a half to actually transport the nearly 2 million American troops across the Atlantic. Because if you just transport 2 million American soldiers on boats at the same time, then guess what that's called? An invasion coming. And so the Germans would know that. So they were travelling on civilian ships. They were travelling on. They took a year and a half to transport millions of American troops across the Atlantic. A year and a half, right? They then spend that year and a half as if they're then, feigning as if they're doing a whole bunch of fake military operations up in Scotland.
They even had Patton there
They
commanding a fake army.
A fake army, a fake training organisation. So when German planes were doing scouting missions, they had inflatable blow-up tanks and cars and
They
trucks.
were pretty good too.
And the actual troops were then living in what functionally were like trenches and bunkers with fake grass covering above them. So it looked like it was just an open field, but there's a whole military installation there. Yeah.
That's real conspiracy.
Yeah. Well, that's just the nature of the espionage nature of how to win a war. But anyway, that's today's passage. The broad meta-narrative point. The evil of this conspiracy, entirely against God, and yet the pagan Romans are the ones who are actually being far more, I say in inverted commas, godly. And so we'll finish off this whole saga in the next lesson. All right? Thank you.